So I thought this evening we could spend some time like just covering some ideas that are worth mentioning, but that don't need a whole hour or a whole episode to kind of develop.
Okay.
But things that people sometimes don't think to talk about or would kind of like to avoid talking about, or that people haven't maybe considered. So one of the ideas I want to talk about starting out is the justice of God, or how he may not come across as being just in this story, especially if you kind of take my rendering of it. And one of the areas where people can kind of get caught up is I am suggesting that God rigged the system. I'm suggesting that he set it such that Adam and Eve would eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that in very many ways they did not have a choice. I've made the claim on here before that because we know that the commanding voice of God interrupts the narrative, we know that they are going to eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because scripture says that he commanded them not to eat, saying, on the day you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. So my claim is that he set this in motion. What he said was not just predictive, but it was prescriptive. He intended this to take place. So I understand that a lot of theologians would have a problem with this, because they're putting everything on this part of the text as the development of free will, and that humans had a choice, and that humans ran renegade and messed things up, and that God, for the rest of future history, is kind of responding and trying to fix the foul up. My claim is that God intended this to exist because it was part of process. The problem, what's at stake here, is that can come across as God being unjust. How can he force us to sin? How can he force us to commit an act that he is displeased with and still be just? And my argument is, as you'll see in a minute here, as I unfold it, is going to be that this act of causing us to be in this position, or causing the human to be in this position, or the man and the woman to be in this position, is the beginning expression of his justice. The problem of justice, if we're going to pick at God for being unjust, comes far before this point in history. It comes when he brings us into existence without our compliance, without our agreement, without our free will. I did not ask to be here. I did not ask to be put in the United States of America. I did not ask to be born of Dolores and Lorenzo Marquez. I didn't agree to that. That wasn't a contract. God did not consult me. This isn't brand new speak. This kind of talk happens in the book of Job. But because I did not have agency in my being created, if we're going to pin God for injustice, it would be right there. So knowing this and being dead set on being just, God works through the story his justice. So you can't bring a being into existence with an agreement if that being didn't exist beforehand. It means that God is going to have to work something out. And so he creates for us the possibility of ontological personhood. He creates for us the possibility to come fully into being and to have full relationship with him. And he brings himself into existence the way he brings us into existence, personified in the person Jesus, to go through everything that we go through on the same terms that we do, so that in the end, as he works through the story, there ends up being full and complete justice. He is sacrificed on the cross in part. I'm not saying this is all of it, but he sacrifices himself on the cross willingly. His complete compliance. It says that part of scripture says that he was obedient even unto death on a cross. And he does this with complete compliance in ways that we might not even had been able to do to completely fulfill his just nature. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you being a literary person, how would you clean that up for me a little bit, Lynn?
I'm still hung up on stuff that happens before.
What do you mean?
I've always been fascinated with this whole discussion around free will. And, having been raised with a set of theology that owes most of its foundation to medieval nonsense that they made up and not actual fact. I'm still sorting through what's real and what's not. So in the tradition I grew up in, the angels had free will, and they chose to disobey. And when they disobeyed, they were not forgiven. And the big difference between angels and humans was always emphasized that humans were redeemable. And so I never looked at it personally as God wasn't being just when he kicked everybody out of Eden. That it was more like a natural consequence that would ultimately lead to not just Adam and Eve's redemption, but all of humanity's redemption. And in that respect, that's your story arc for the whole Bible, right? That the salvation of humankind, of humanity, begins in Eden, and there's nothing accidental or reactive about the redemption of humanity, that it was all intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes the story so much more interesting than these just little micro encounters of early Jewish culture in the Torah, right?
Yeah, so let me just pause and say, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that God was ever unjust. What I'm saying is, if we were going to pin injustice on him, it would be at the point of creation.
Yeah, I got that.
Right. I know these are difficult concepts, and so I want to make sure that whoever's watching doesn't kind of misunderstand what I'm saying. I do not believe that God is unjust or ever has been unjust. I'm saying, as an academic exercise, if we were going to pin injustice on him, it would be in him creating us without our agreements. And knowing this, he compensates and overcompensates to ensure that his justice reigns in the dynamic. And this is something that people don't think about very often. And that's kind of my way of coming in and saying that him rigging the system is not unjust. It's actually him creating the possibility for us to have personhood. It's him creating the possibility of an ontological development, which would not otherwise exist.
A divine ontological for the...
So like we talked about last
For the
week,
theologically challenged, please.
ontology is about the development of being. It's about being. So us coming into completeness of who we are. Last week I talked about the example of bread. The dough is kind of on its way to being bread, but it's not bread. For the bread to come into its ontological fullness, it needs to become the finished product of being bread. But coming into that ontological fullness, that whole process of going from dry goods, adding a little water, getting kneaded, and going through the process. I should pause and say, hey, Sal.
Hey, what's up, guys?
I thought maybe you were having a baby tonight.
Oh, man. No, not tonight. It would have been a bad dry run. I locked my keys in my car.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I'm glad that didn't spiral to finally getting home and being like, where's Jocelyn? Oh, man. But yeah, I'm glad we're recording this so I can go back and watch, see what I missed.
You didn't miss much.
No, I got here late too.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question too, though, because that's been, like I saw your Facebook post tonight, comparing, or it was Truth Sojourner.
Sojourner Truth.
Yeah, Sojourner Truth, a famous speech that kind of matched the theme of what we're doing tonight. And yeah, you used ontological, and I was like, what does that mean exactly? So, yeah.
What I mean by that is just how philosophers use it is they talk about being and beingness and how the fullness of a person's personhood, and that is developmental. We don't just like plop into existence and we're fully us. It takes a lifetime to become the fullness of who we are. But it seems as though for anybody who's like reasonable, it seems as though it's the experience, it's the journey, it's what we go through. Oftentimes it's what we suffer
The process,
that brings about the fullness of who we are. And all of that is kind of ontology. And I'm using it kind of in a loose sense. Ontology obviously is the study of. But when I talk about ontological wholeness or completeness, I don't know that very many people are using that phrase. I'm kind of using it because I struggle to talk about the process of becoming who we completely are. It's kind of an awkward. We don't.
I mean, I like it. Would you use it to describe like an individual? Like, could an individual have an ontological development? Or are you more just talking about a big philosophical concept?
Yeah, so here's another phrase.
So Louis Ray actually posted in response to my comment about the angels versus the humans. And Louis Ray said that the angels don't have the ontological hope that humans do.
I believe that's true. So
that was his use of it. That they don't have the developmental piece that leads to redemption, right? The ability to, I guess, repent or grow or change or whatever that makes all of that possible. Hi, Theo.
I'm trying to tell Theo, you can't yell right now, son. Right. So here's another term, and this is going to be useful as we move forward. There's a term called diachronic identity. And what that
Oh my God.
What that means is that we change in substance, but we don't change in who we are. So really, like Descartes came up with this idea, and he talks about a ball of wax. And he's like, here's a ball of wax. It's cold and it's round. I'm going to warm it up. Well, it's not round anymore, and it's fluid, but it's still wax. And so he changes its shape and he changes its form, and he's like, it keeps changing And what I'm holding in my hand now is not what I started with in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't look the same. It doesn't act the same. It's different in every way. And yet I still know that it's the same ball of wax. So it has changed its form, but it's still the same thing. And so we have diachronic identity. The baby Adam in 1972, a little crying thing who didn't have memory behind it or much, didn't have any form of development, is far different than the person I am today. And yet it's the same exact human. I'm the same person. And so it's that change, which is the ontological development. And it could be argued, I believe, that angels were created to do what they do. There's no ontological development. They serve a purpose. They might be sentient, but there's not really development, and there is no ontological hope in the sense of salvation like you're talking about, Lynn. And just to kind of like add to that, one of the things that I will end up challenging over time, and I don't know, maybe it'll turn into a discussion organically here tonight, but I am going to say that I don't buy into the Lucifer falling from heaven and being the devil and taking a third of the angels with him story. What ends up happening is there are several different things that happen in the Bible at different places in the Bible, and these different pieces have been woven into one giant story. And I think they sit and exist better not woven together, because I don't think there's a literary justification to weave these things together that I believe are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think that they are almost complete fiction.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, where does that come from? Because that's totally like a concept I have of Christianity, and I have no idea where I got it from, really, you know?
Oh, you should have seen my face when Adam told me it was fiction. I mean, I've been Lutheran for like forever.
Yeah.
Like since kindergarten. And I remember just being floored to hear that this was really another medieval church construct like the cult of Mary. The worship of Mary didn't happen in the original church. It came much, much later. Like, was it 13th century? Or was it a little bit earlier?
Well, some of it was cultural. It takes on more form in different cultures.
Yeah.
And it's not really church dogma.
No. In fact, it's referred to by historians as the cult of Mary. It's always interesting to read about the church by people who don't believe in God. It's fascinating, the differences. One of my history professors assigned a book. It was one of his books that he wrote, but it was about miracles something in Mary, and it was all about this extra stuff that the church in the Middle Ages sort of invented as they went along.
Yeah, so there are a couple of key places, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but I'm sure I've piqued some interest, and I'm sure I've made some people really upset, so I should address that a little bit. But in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Isaiah, right? Am I thinking correctly? I had quite a day too, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man.
But there is the king of Tyre and there is Lucifer, who are in two completely different books of the Bible, and they're given in two completely different contexts. And I get the two confused often. I need to look them up, and I didn't come prepared with notes for that material because I wasn't expecting to talk about it. But the king of Tyre, archaeology suggests of the king of Tyre and Lucifer that they existed in space-time history. These people were known kings. And they are being spoken of poetically in the middle of poetry. So in each book, there's a similar project taking place where God, through the prophet, is calling out king after king after king who are in violation of what he requires. And he's calling them to clean up their act. And he says it in great poetic language. At one point, I think it's right next to the king of Tyre, he talks about how the trees of Lebanon are singing. And so we don't say that these things that took place are untrue. You and I kind of had this conversation before we started these Zoom sessions, so a similar conversation about what truth is. We don't say that these accounts are untrue or that they didn't take time in space-time history. We talk about, and we kind of talked a little bit like this here on Zoom when we were talking about Chagall and the painting. We say that God is trying to, through the prophet, emphasize characteristics that are taking place. So he speaks of Lucifer and he says, you see yourself as this high and mighty thing. You think you can challenge me. You have ascended into the high places. And he goes on and on with this embellished kind of poetic imagery that exaggerates what is humanly possible.
That's called hyperbole.
Yeah, it's hyperbole. He has this hyperbole that's it's driving to get the point across that this individual was extraordinarily terrible. I mean, and that he was extraordinarily prideful. And the way to describe this pride is to do it in hyperbole to get us on track with how things go. That's how poetry oftentimes works. That's oftentimes how art works. Well, there's another character, the king of Tyre, who has some of the same characteristics. And it's interesting that in both texts, what's happening is each of these kings are given much hyperbole to bring out the qualities that God is hammering against. So when we look at Lucifer, the chapter before him has a different king who has these extreme characteristics. And the chapter after him has a king. And I can't remember, I get them confused a lot of times.
So the king of Tyre is in Ezekiel, and
Okay.
the reference to Lucifer is in Isaiah.
Okay.
I looked it up.
Okay. So I don't know if you can kind of track this a little bit and see if I'm getting the right character at the right time. But in the chapter after Lucifer, I believe it was, the next character is talked about as a dragon. And he's given these characteristics of being this bad guy with this like dragon imagery. And I don't think there's anybody in church history who has been taken seriously, who has believed that there was a literal dragon that was being talked about. It's poetry. The church has always known that it's poetry. It is using hyperbole to bring out the characteristics of this particular king. Was it Lucifer or the king of Tyre? Are you looking?
It was after Lucifer.
Right. And so if we're really being true to what is most satanic like,
Joe looked it up too.
we would think that it was, we would use this king that was like a dragon, right? That's useful.
So
Go ahead.
we have a question from the audience.
Uh-huh.
Maggie wants to know, so was it poetry or hyperbole when Jesus said, quote, I saw Satan fall from the sky? Or
Right.
like lightning from the sky.
So this is the third text that is kind of woven together. And I think Jesus is referring to something that he actually experienced, and he's cueing us in to give us a message. I would not even say that that's hyperbole. I think it's something that Jesus in his godness witnessed, but it's its own event. It doesn't have to be married to the king of Tyre and to Lucifer. And so what happens is Lucifer's kind of story gets married to the king of Tyre's story, who are in two totally different books with two completely different projects going and lots of kings to choose from. And those two are kind of just picked out and woven together, and then they're seamed together with what Jesus said.
Well, you know why? Because every story needs a bad guy. I'm serious. That from a literary point of view, it's easier to sell your idea with a man versus man conflict, right? We've got a good guy and a bad guy, and human beings, we relate to these stories so much better, because you have to remember, like, well, maybe you don't know, but through the development of the novel, psychological stories where we look just at how the character develops over time aren't even invented until the late 1800s at all. So like we don't see inside characters' heads before then, as a written society. Like it just doesn't exist. So this idea that the conflict in Genesis is inside Adam and Eve wouldn't work for the development of the audience. Does that make sense?
So Lynn is saying that how we read story and how we express story has changed over time. Like there was no Cubist art
right
early on. Cubism comes later, so people would not have characterized things that way. However, the argument goes that God in anticipation was able to give us a more developed sense of story before people knew how to write stories that way. And so he kind of worked a seed of this ontological development, which isn't something that people really expressed back and forth easily early on, but it's kind of available to us now. And he knew that this would kind of unfold.
So if you look at like the simple story structure in Genesis, for example, right? God is sort of the parent figure, and he says, dude, if you do this, these are the consequences. That's a kind of relationship that humans from very, very early on, before the written word, are going to understand that dynamic completely, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So as time passed, because, the Bible was written by a bajillion people over lots and lots of years, by the time we get to the New Testament, we have a more developed sense of story, sense of the world, sense of whatever. And the story can become more sophisticated, and our concept of
I guess I'm now kind of understanding a little better.
Our concept of Satan is going to be different in the New Testament.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say I'm pretty content with the just kind of the answer that if there's a higher power trying to communicate to humanity using people and storytelling, that there's going to be like hyperbole and just these ways of painting these pictures and telling these things, where each book is kind of telling its own story and has a fit inside the arc. So I mean, I can see how just the structure of the story and using the storytelling, you can use things like what were in those two books that, you know, somehow people want to extrapolate into like something very like physical, like a devil, a dude with a red tail and flames underneath. You know, I kind of get it in Genesis. I get like the whole describing the heavens and the earth and that kind of thing, in that sense of like, maybe it's like physical. It's not that it's not true, but it's like, what words do you have to describe something that's so beyond human
Right.
comprehension? So you have to use these mechanisms in order to get these ideas across. So I'm getting that, and that's why I think these conversations have been so great, in the sense of, I mean, it's been like Christianity has been like telephoned, you know, to where it's like, if you don't have, you know, if you keep kind of a random exposure to Christianity or something, you're just going to get these stories that are like, what? And so far away from the actual text and the actual metaphors or hyperbole being used into just something like an elevator pitch for Christianity or something like
And
that.
if you pull them out of context, if you pull them out of the appropriate trajectory, right? That's the word we're using. It totally changes how the story plays out completely, right down to the personalities of the characters.
Right. So that kind of brings us full circle. And so I'll put into context what we're saying and why we're saying it. When I'm talking about this character of the devil, what ends up happening is, so this is a little bit of a history lesson, and I'm not getting too precise or too specific here, but just enough to kind of whet your appetite to go do some research. Basically, you have the Jewish believing community who had their own kind of theology that was always evolving, and it kind of had its own diachronic identity. How people understood it kind of changed over time, but it was always developmental, and it wasn't like so innovative that the rest was thrown away. But it's like Ezekiel and Isaiah, who we were talking about with these two characters, are retelling the stories that we've already heard for ways that were useful in their contemporary moment, and that thought forward and gave some ingredients for Jesus to come in and have story as well. And so everything is connected. But they're changing and evolving kind of sense of theology or belief in God. It's even problematic to use the word theology because it wasn't so systematized. It wasn't so perfectly worked out. It was a developing context of who God is and their role with God. Well, when Christianity takes hold, Jesus comes and is kind of another developmental stage of this ongoing diachronic identity of the believing community and of Yahweh, God. Christianity gets dispersed across the world, and it gets farther and farther distanced from the source. And so we start getting theological takes on things. We start getting philosophic takes on things that were not married in any way to the original culture or beliefs. Now, we have to hold some ideas in tension here. The Pharisees were in the New Testament, and they were like the golden age holders of Judaism. Like, they were the cream of the crop. And Jesus comes and says, like, nice work, guys. However, you got a lot of this wrong. And he comes and he goes against a lot of what they had to say. So just because it was a belief was native to their ideas doesn't mean that it was God's idea of how it should be understood. And so he always had humanity on this trajectory of understanding him and his Bible in better and better ways. But that being said, we have this jump from the early believers, like the apostles and the people they were teaching, to people who were removed from them in culture and time. So 300 years after Jesus dies, in other countries who knew very little about Judaism whatsoever, are starting to make all of these rulings and calls on how the Bible is to be read and understood. And some of these guys were like the top stars and of philosophy for their day. And one guy in particular, I like to pick on him a lot. people in the church know him as St. Augustine, and philosophers refer to him as Augustine. He comes in and he's a rhetorist, and nobody can out-argue him. So a lot of what he had to say becomes foundational truth for theology for the rest of history. Well, one of the things he does is he comes in with this particular take of Genesis. His interpretation of Genesis has everything to do with this idea that Adam and Eve blew it and God is being reactionary. Well, if we start with that hermeneutical lens and we read the rest of the Bible with that baseline, a lot of things kind of don't make sense in the book.
Oh, they're breaking.
You have to start weaving the story to retrofit to fit into that narrative. And one of the things that was done was the Satan story. So now, I'm not saying that Augustine did this. Now people are picking from different parts of the book, and they're like, this sounds similar, and this sounds similar. This works, and look, if we build it to go like this, it really matches with or it coordinates really well with
What's wrong with you?
how we're understanding Genesis, right? And that's why I've been emphasizing Genesis so much and saying, like, we got to get this part right so we understand the rest of the book. Well, historically, what ends up happening is you have some key writers. You have Dante, you have Milton, you have, and Lynn is going to probably jump in and say what some more of the famous works were. But you have like the Divine Comedy. These guys go in and they talk about heaven and hell in great detail. But all the details they give are inspired by the Bible, but are not in the Bible. And then, but it's so believable and it's such good literature. The tendency for society who may not even have the Bible in this point in history, your common person didn't have the text to read. So they're going off of what the academics say. And these academics have these great literary works, and they're putting down that hell looks like this, and the devil looks like that. And in order to kind of get this historical novel writing going, they pick from Ezekiel and they pick from Isaiah and they match it to what Jesus is saying, but there's no rational reason to do that outside of we're weaving a story for our agenda. Like Ezekiel does not lend itself to being interpreted that way, and Isaiah does not lend itself to being interpreted that way, and nobody would think to put those things together unless they were like Stephen Kinging this, right? Yeah. Like making up a story on top of the story. And in so doing, it's easy to kind of like grab whatever works. And that's what ended up taking place. But it's not like the early believer ever thought that what Jesus was saying was tied to the king of Tyre or to Lucifer. Like that connection would have never been made until these novelists come along. And they really were novelists. I mean, they weren't trying to rewrite the Bible. They were giving a story to society. When your headphones were off, Lynn, I was saying like Milton and Dante.
Yeah. So I actually wrote a paper about the literary origin of Satan, which I should send to you, Adam. I don't think you've ever read it. But I did it in graduate school for my Milton class. So Milton was a Puritan, and he felt like...
What's our time period here? When did he write?
1600s. So this would be just after Shakespeare.
Which is how many years after Jesus died? Just to make this crystal clear.
1600 and some, like 1620.
Okay.
So that's almost 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So it's a really long time. So Milton comes along and he says, nobody really understands what God did in the first 3 books of Genesis. So I'm gonna, or the first 3 chapters we call them. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna write this poem. It is an epic poem, meaning it goes on and on forever. and it is amazing, but it's not for the faint of heart. And his intention was to prove that God did the right thing by kicking mankind out of Eden. And his only source material is Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Instead, what he produced is the most lovable rendition of Satan I have ever read. Satan is the best character in the whole, there's 3 books. And in Paradise Lost, Satan steals the show, which is highly ironic. But from there, every single literary or cinematic portrayal of the devil as a character comes from Milton. Every single last one.
Like the red, the tail.
Yeah. What he looks like.
Satan was never conceptualized that way before Milton.
Right. He was not at all. And so, like, just to give you an idea of the impact. So Milton is an English poet writing at the tail end of the English Renaissance and really the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment. And religion is about to fall out of favor pretty quickly in the next 100 years. As the Age of Enlightenment and secular humanism starts to come up on the rise, right? So 200 years after Milton in America, so we've gotten on boats and we've sailed all the way across the Atlantic, people in New England, like Nathaniel Hawthorne, are writing stories about the devil in America. And he bears a striking resemblance to Milton's Satan. So Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote all kinds of creepy sort of proto-Gothic stories about temptation and all kinds of really Puritan themes. You know, he wrote The Scarlet Letter and some other stuff. And so from him, other people start using Satan as a character. Mark Twain wrote a scathing satire called Letters from the Earth, where the whole book is written from Satan's point of view. He's writing home to his homeboys, the other archangels, Raphael and Michael and Gabriel. And so you see all of human history from the devil's perspective, living in exile on the earth. And it is scorchingly funny. But like today, there's a series on Netflix called Lucifer. And it's all about him.
Yeah.
He's portrayed in...
What about Dante?
Oh God, Dante.
So Dante comes earlier.
Dante is a no, he's not a contemporary of Milton's. He's before Milton. Dante would be like late 1300s, early 1400s.
He wrote the Inferno.
He wrote the Inferno. So what he did is he describes also in some seriously epic poetry the theological framework of the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. So imagine, if you will, the earth is in the middle, okay? And then below the earth, there's, well, kind of, yeah. There's, 9 layers of hell? 9 levels of hell? 12 levels of hell? 9. Anyway, so each level of hell is, in his poetry, lovingly described and populated with actual human beings, like, that people would know. It's like your
Caesar is in there.
It's like your who's who of misfits. Several popes are in different levels of hell.
Like if he would have been modern, he would have had Hitler in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was like but some of these people were contemporary. Like these were people, this was political commentary, and it was like he was calling people out on their lack of morals, and he was assigning them to an appropriate consequence based on the structure of heaven and hell. So this idea of being tortured by devils with pitchforks comes from Dante.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the popes is hung upside down and constantly poked by demons with pitchforks because he was such an evil person. And then on the other side of the sphere of Earth, right, you've got purgatory, which I guess you can be prayed out of. And then you've got 9 levels of heaven. So there's 3 books.
So the point to all of this is that most of what we believe about Satan comes from literary machinations that come way later in history from the source text, the Bible. But if we read the Bible without any of those stories in our minds, we would never naturally connect the story of Lucifer, the king of Tyre, and what Jesus says, I believe it's in John, I think it's in the book of John, of Satan falling from heaven. And so he falls from heaven, and there's a third of the angels with him. But if we don't put that in the context of Lucifer, we can come up with Jesus saying other theological statements. If we have in our memory those layers that we've been told, then we only hear what Jesus is saying in light of Lucifer as Satan. And that's not, there's enough like in common that you can say, oh, I see how that fits together. But they're distance in like the pieces of the Bible. Like you don't get to just choose a verse here and pluck it to this verse and pluck it to that verse. But that's what these guys did.
Yeah.
And so
I follow that like 100%, and I'll totally let you move on. And I just think like it totally makes it makes a lot of sense that I bet the Bible's just full of this kind of stuff where even the authors, maybe people who are very familiar with the Bible, but they're using their own, it's for their own intentions, their own purposes, and maybe whatever they're even saying, you know, later authors can get lost on people. So this thing can just take on a whole evolution of its own, become something totally different. So
well, I will tell you that this happens in fiction.
yeah.
Because the same source material, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, that Milton uses to write his story, is also used in a book like His Dark Materials, which was written by a raging atheist, Philip Pullman. He's a very, very hostile atheist. Lots of atheists just run around and don't believe in God. And hey, that's cool. But he actually runs around and verbally argues with Christians because he's got an axe to grind. So he's using the same exact source material. So with the Bible, how it was put together and why it was put together, it was really important that the words were consistent with a couple of things. Adam, remind me what they are. Because it was
I don't know where you're going yet.
You don't know where I'm going? They were not, they had to be consistent with each other. So when you look at all of the extant literature, there's a whole bunch, like, for example, in the Catholic Bible, that's not in the Protestant Bible.
Are you talking about like criteria to be in the canon?
Yeah, and I'm talking about the authors weren't using poetic license so much when they were writing, as they were limited by their writing ability to express whatever it was God was trying to get them to write down.
So
you see what I'm saying? Because I don't want people to think that.
Okay, so let's say it this way. When we're reading the Bible, there are rules to the game. It's not just anything goes. So there are accepted ways of kind of doing the work of reading the Bible that have always kind of been accepted through the Jewish community. And those rules are kind of important. The more we can do those well, the better off we are. Now, so I liken this a lot of times to jazz. I don't know if we've talked about this on Zoom yet, but I liken doing theology or reading the Bible in terms of like jazz. We know what jazz is. If we hear jazz, we know it's jazz. If we hear something that's not jazz, we know it's not jazz, because jazz is distinctive and it has its own rules to the game. But they're not hard and fast rules that you have to obey. It's just that if you veer from those rules, you end up with not jazz. And if you only do what other people have done, well, you might as well listen to the original people, because you're not freshly doing jazz. You're just redoing what somebody else did, right? Like
You're doing a cover.
Right, you're doing a cover. It's derivative. But yet, the possibilities for jazz are infinite, or at least from our perception, they're infinite. But there are qualities of jazz, and there are kinds of jazz. And so if I'm engaged in this kind of jazz, it has to take on X characteristics. Then there's a quality to jazz that's really intangible. Like a person who's just got that soul can bring it out in jazz, unlike a person who's technically good, but just doesn't have that soul. And theology is a lot like this. The thing about jazz too is a jazz great who's like riffing out some jazz is retelling the whole history of jazz in what he or she is doing in that moment. But what they're doing is they're simultaneously tipping their hat to all the greats that came before, and they're putting their own signature on all of the jazzness that came before them and making a contemporary statement. And that's how theology should work. You can't veer from how this is properly done too far, or you've just got something else, like what Milton did, like what Dante did. They went beyond the riff. They started doing their own thing, and they made something that was extra biblical. But the people who were their audience did not make a distinction or differentiation. They had not heard the original text probably, or in a very limited sense, and they were removed in language. Most of them had been hearing it in Latin instead of the Hebrew or the Greek. And they weren't reading it for themselves, and they were removed from Jewish culture. So they don't know that this is not jazz, or they don't know that this is not jazz. They're just like, oh, okay, this is what it is. Not unlike you, like this is what Christianity is. Yeah. And so when we go back to the text, the thing to do is to do things the way Jesus did them, and to do things the way all of the writers in the canon did them. Like it's important for us to know, I pick on Ezekiel all the time because I'm fascinated with that book. But like Ezekiel the prophet, he's using scripture that came before him all the time. How was he using that scripture? If I can use scripture in a similar kind of way, or if I can take my cues from him, even if I'm not using the same scripture verses, I'm on solid ground. Jesus does it. Paul does it. Every canonical writer, and Jesus, because he didn't really write, but he was doing this theology in ways that are useful for us and that are authorized for us. If we are uncovering the text in ways that they were, and we're riffing in the style that they riffed, we're on good terms. When we take it away from there and we're doing a new thing, it could be cool. I mean, Dante's Inferno is an intense piece of art, but it ain't jazz. It ain't Judeo-Christian thought, right? And so there's no final answer, or there's no perfect way to do a contemporary riff. but there are qualities that can be known by whoever hears and is familiar with the material. And that's what you're shooting for. And it's supposed to be wide open because it's supposed to be universal enough to speak to any time and to any person, but it's supposed to be cohesive enough that it's not just anything goes. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Yeah, I'm like, I feel like we maybe waded a little bit into like a theological like discussion or something. Like there's some theological controversy there or something. Because I'm like totally content to be like, yeah, that makes more sense than the Red Devil Tale story I had. Like, you
well,
know.
The problem is, and kind of my contribution, what I have to offer is some of these kinds of hermeneutical lenses, I guess. And it's not, the things that I'm presenting here are not things that are typically presented in Christian circles. I mean, everything I say for a Bible believing individual should be good to go, like on logic, but it's unfamiliar territory for most Christians because most Christians have been taught of a historical Christianity that developed. Yeah. But that historical Christianity needs to be questioned because these extra parts that we got, some of them are useful. Like the idea of Trinity, I was just talking to my friend Joe about this earlier. It's a doctrine, it's a theological kind of construct that is clearly seen in Scripture, and it's useful to talk about it. It's very useful and it's accurate. It's true to the Bible, but it's nowhere in the Bible. Like the term Trinity is not. And it's not anything that the apostles directly talked about or Jesus directly talked about. They indirectly kind of referred to it all the time, but they never made a specific point of it. So to talk about Trinity and to use that, it could be very useful. So we can kind of look at that and say, hey, that's useful, let's bring it in over here. But we do it with intentionality. We know its history. We understand why it's there. We understand its role in the project we have at hand.
And it doesn't contradict anything else that we know is true about the Bible. I mean, that's the other really essential piece, right?
Yeah. And it doesn't feel like a stretch. It's a useful mechanism.
Right.
Unlike
you can't just
pulling
get up
from Dante or from Isaiah, like pulling things together that aren't naturally just like a theme, kind of forcing it.
Yeah, so you just can't wake up and say, oh, I heard from God and this is what he said, and write like a new epistle.
And this like very obscure line here in the Bible seems to justify it if I take it out of context or something.
Right. I mean, it has to be not only useful, but it has to mesh with things we already know that are true that Jesus said.
Yes. So that's kind of how my perspective differs. It should not be like a revolutionary perspective, but it's not the norm of what has been taught in church, because a lot of those ideas that came in layers of history just were not questioned. They were taken for granted by people who didn't have the source text.
Yeah, I saw a video recently from the guy at the Bible Project, and he used the term like churchianity just to kind of describe that, and that like a lot of the people like he was going through his master class with or something would be it'd be a scandal to their faith to just like kind of learn the human origins of the Bible, instead of it being like, yeah, this is like historical evidence that really is like should be strengthening it, but just from like, if that's the only way you got it through kind of this long arc of people playing jazz and sometimes not jazz, and you're not necessarily a jazz player yourself or a jazz historian where you can suss out the roots to these things, that like if you start getting exposed to that, it could just seem like, oh man, this isn't what I was told. This feels like not jazz.
So
it's 8:30.
Okay, so I did not intend to go into any of this territory tonight, so it was pretty extemporaneous. So if people have questions, please question. If I had time to kind of lay it out and present it, it probably would come out a little bit more smoothly, or I would have included other ideas. But that's okay. I want these discussions to be kind of organic and to cover things where audience's mind wanders and audience's mind questions. I want to be able to address those things. I really dislike formats where a question will, like, I don't know, derail the whole thing or be left unanswered. So I probably created many more questions, but at least we're hitting up some difficult things that a lot of people would not want to touch with the 10-foot pole.
Yeah,
So,
I felt like that makes a lot of sense because, this was good. Good discussion where it definitely feels like we're not just passing over stuff. I'm able to fully kind of understand some important concepts that apply generally.
cool. So next week we will deal with some other issues and maybe fill in some blanks that with material that I intended for this week, but we'll see how it goes.
Cool. I'll see you guys.
See you next week.
See you
Unless
next
you have a
week.
baby.
Yeah, oh boy. Maybe.
Bye, Facebook world.